This is a good one for you, Brent.
Oh.
Mhm.
All right, let's see what the YouTube channel looks like. Got the Zoom going. And oh, good. We're live on YouTube. Hey, how you doing? We're professionals here. And, oh, here comes Jabe. Can't have a DX chat without Jabe. Can't have a DX chat without Jabe.
Hey man, how are you?
What's going on, Jabe? What's going on? All right, we're off to the races. We've got that stand. All right. What gives on DevNet, man? You can't just say SDN is dead. Long live SDN. Sorry, network dude. Not gonna let you get away with that.
Oh. That. No, that didn't post.
How smart I am. I mistyped Tau. What is the translation of Tau?
My favorite translation is the one by Ursula Le Guin, but there's many different translations of the Tao Te Ching. Tao is the way.
The way, okay.
I'm pretty sure it's not sort of dead networking.
Yeah,
That
I
can go
mean,
with my background file with my other favorite one, which is Wiki, which stands for Where Information Kills Itself.
I like it. I
Or
like
SDN.
it.
Are there any SDN deadheads?
What were you gonna say, Brett?
Yeah, I mean, it's, and just to elaborate a little bit, it's what was always missing in the early SDN conversations was the actual implementation. So, early on it was how do we take these ASICs and try and program them in ways they weren't designed to be programmed in. So with virtual networking, with treating that, with being able to consume networking the same way we consume commodity compute.
Yeah.
We're no longer worried about every byte that we write, in a data path or in a control plane. So, the harness is off and we're off to the races because there is no limitation anymore. In the hardware world, every single byte represents a huge dollar figure. And now it's,
I always wonder about to me, it seems like commodity compute or, compute pools and things like that take off because, in fact, software engineers generally understand CPUs. Like, I understand how that works and it's not a super mystery to me. On the other hand, you hand a software engineer, here's a programming language version of networking, and they go, what's networking?
right.
I mean, I have a computer, talks to another computer, somebody else's problem. How that happens, not mine. I mean, how many software engineers really have the ability, the capacity to understand any real networking concerns? I mean, being that real networking people have a hard time with real networking. I don't know.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And that's like part of the hard transition, because most people that are writing networking software probably, well, I wouldn't say, some percentage started out in networking and transitioned into software. So that's what we're starting to see today.
Yeah.
It's tough to go the other direction because, I mean, I spent the first decade of my career doing nothing but architecting, designing, implementing, operating networks.
Yeah.
And it's just not something, I can learn a programming language and, give me a couple of months, I'll figure out the semantics of it. But,
Right.
I'm not going to be able to figure out how the internet works in 90 days.
Really? Why not?
I mean, yeah, right. Just BDP and you're done.
I just think it's really, I was a CTO for a long time, and it was just always like those ops people made the network work. And I knew when it didn't work, but other than that, like, what?
Yeah. No, I definitely identify myself as a network engineer first and a terrible software engineer second.
Yeah,
But like,
Most software engineers have no idea how networking works.
that's where we were.
Yeah. That's great job security, right?
well, and I think if you've never actually been in the position of, having to have been an end user of all of that equipment and understanding what the heck is going on, then trying to design that software just by like, here's the feature list, can you go implement this? Like, there's 1,000 ways to implement a feature, but unless you have the sort of the empathy of having been in that spot before, unless you're deeply talking to people all the time and having close feedback loops, I think it's really, really hard to just get into the right mindset to make it user friendly, or even for seasoned networking people. Like,
Yeah, Robin's spot on. I mean, so that empathy in developing, whether you're developing product, whether you're writing open source, or whether you're writing code for, your enterprise, like, I think the other exciting thing is there's so much opportunity for the networking community to transition and to learn and grow. And, it's probably what excites me the most about the whole evolution into SDN is, showing people kind of this career progression and this path forward.
Hey, Brent, when you think about like moving from, I'm always interested. I started as a software engineer CTO person, so I will never have the ability to have the other version of the experience. But when you started to like go from being a network person to a software engineer using software engineering to manage networks, I assume that's roughly correct. What were the most interesting or important software practices that really like got you hooked on that? Like, oh wait, if I treat the network as a piece of software, it gives me new powers. What were the particular practices that made the most sense, or had the most leverage?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say I brought Agile into enterprises and, had these great success stories. But really, it started out with like a lot of us just writing terrible Perl scripts and keeping them on our, Solaris boxes where nobody knew where they existed. And like if that guy had a heart attack and died, the whole network would be down, or you'd lose DNS for the next year. I think we're starting to get there. The tooling is out there. So like one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently with, with the work from home, like network engineers never work from home. Like they're the dinosaurs of the dinosaurs. And like, if your ass isn't in the seat, you're not working. That's getting broken now. And so I am starting to see like Agile starting to pop up in networking. It's just common sense stuff. I need a daily stand up so I know what everybody's doing, because I can't I can't do my managerial circle around the cubes and make sure, everybody's face down in the CLI or, working on some kind of config.
So I would say the SDN evolution is going through, similar to the DevOps tooling adoption. And this is what I see in the way this gets deployed right now. And I won't necessarily name any SDN products or projects, but you basically have this situation where the networking people don't associate themselves with software development, right? Which we saw over and over in the sysadmins when in the early days of kind of like Puppet, Chef, whatever, where they're like, oh, that's code. That's what other people do. right? Like we do this stuff this way. We're sysadmins. I think there's a little bit of that in the network side. And then the flip side is you don't have software developers that understand networking, and they're not necessarily working together or talking together. So in my opinion, from my vantage point, I think a lot of the SDN deployments basically get kind of sold as shelfware. Like this, it's like a vendor incentivized transaction. And then there's like SDN, where on one hand, the network people don't really want to program against it. And on the other hand, the software people don't understand the domain either. And so you kind of like have a SDN product that's sort of set up and configured by hand like you would traditional switches or what have you. And then everyone backs away slowly and it kind of sits there, right? So like there's this imagined future where there's like all this stuff working together, and you're programmatically manipulating the topologies based on the needs of these applications. And so there's like some understanding of all this, and goes back to policy, and like that's this magic thing that I think we can get to. But we're like so far from that in most organizations, just because of like this, and I'll use the language that we're starting to adopt now. There's not been a commoning and like an understanding between those disciplines and those personas to take advantage of the domain understanding and expertise of both. And that's like something that is more advanced in DevOps, but not necessarily solved either. But I see lots of these sort of shelfware SDN deployments where nothing is programmatically being manipulated at the network layer.
It's hard too, because you think about just a typical IT developer who, developers are the new kingmakers, right? And you have 1,000 tools out there that you can go and choose from to build whatever you want. But I mean, which makes it easy for people to try things out, decide if it's a good tool, a bad tool, a useful tool, a crap tool. But I mean, unless you're going to be like, hey, I'm going to set up a new SDN network at my house this weekend, and then maybe I'll come to work and tell everyone about it. But you're not just going to, throw that, maybe you'll set up a miniature POC in the corner of the company. But, you got to pick something at some layer and get everybody on board with it. It's not just,
So we're serfs, the old kingmakers, because I don't know about the I kind of reject that premise, but we can talk about that.
Nonetheless, it's.
I mean, people throw it around.
If people,
we got a new visitor, Jay.
Hey, Jay.
Hey, how are you doing?
Shout out.
Hey, Jay.
hey,
How are y'all doing? New York City represent.
There you go.
Nice.
So I'm listening to your little SDN conversation, and it reminds me of some time where I was at a place that desperately needed it. And it actually set back productivity of the business to a point where it was proposed, I guess, when I worked there. I don't work there. I haven't worked there in like 7 years, maybe 6 years. And they finally implemented it based on the kind of customer base that's cloud related. It was kind of wild to watch like an unfettered network that had to be managed by switches and all this manual routing as opposed to using SDN. It was terrifying, and it set back the ability to create private like VPC style networks. It set back the ability to actually acquire customers because of the lack of separation of networks. Even in the private networks, there was still too many issues with noisy neighbors and not enough smart ways to isolate that via software. So it's just interesting to see, like, when you watch something not have an SDN, and then when you see it actually implemented years later and find out the rapid change that happened based on it, it's pretty nuts. So that's my little add to this.
I want to throw another thing out there, and then I want to see how Brent responds or comments he wants to make on top of it, which is when you look at the automation evolution from like the system DevOps perspective, there's a huge missed opportunity when you go from what you have and just automate it, right? And I'm sure Robin has some comments here as well. So it's like you have why things exist and you have what exists, right? So if you only understand what exists, you're kind of doomed to automate what exists in the new way. But you can often solve a lot of problems by revisiting why things exist and simplify the architecture in a way that it's actually designed to be automated, right? Because if you have certain architecture, certain types of applications, they weren't born in a world where they're designed to be automated, and automating them is actually a huge mistake. And they'll fight against you, and you're not necessarily getting more operational advantage from doing that. So I don't know the specifics of what you just described, but remind me of these patterns where I've seen this many times. And so like what I encourage people to do when they're thinking about taking on a big automation project is don't just take what you do now, take the process that you have now, take the architecture you have now and automate that, revisit why you have these processes, and you can save yourself a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of heartache, a lot of tears and blood if you revisit why and build that up from first principles.
Yeah, because if you have a tool that can actually automate in some way the approval processes or et cetera, what you don't need is some weird bash script that somebody has to hit enter on, like at the terminal in the back room, to get approval from someone in another department before they go on to the next stage of something, like, and that would be, if your tool can handle stuff like that for you, then it would be silly to also re-implement, that fraction of things. I remember back in my sysadmin days, like it was anytime we needed to do networking stuff, like we could handle everything in IT, the DBAs, all the people writing at the applications, and literally everything flowed pretty well until it was time to actually install it and then get some networking things. Because then it was like, open up a separate ticket with the networking folks.
Mhm.
Definitely never, ever, 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 ever let you, no matter how simple it is. I need an IP address. We need at least like 2 weeks time, and
Yeah, and attend the meeting and make sure that you bring your documentation, your diagram, and everything in order to be able to get it approved.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many beautiful topics there. I'll try and just skim a couple of them really quick. I mean, so to Andrew's point, automating bad architecture, like that's a really good point, because like, why would I want to go in and like, okay, we've got this really bad architecture that's overly complicated, that's got 2 decades of technical debt, but we're going to automate it and make it easy to sustain that technical debt for the next 10 years, because it just costs money at the end of the day. But the problem always with the network, and I would say most critical parts of your infrastructure, is you can't just take them down. They're fragile. While they may be eventually consistent and tolerate some faults, at the end of the day, odds are if you go in and start breaking things in your network, unless you're overstaffed and have lots of money to throw at problems, you're going to create more problems. So all hard problems to solve. On top of that, you can't, because of that fragility, you can't just go in and change things. You have to go through, possibly weeks of change control. So now your agility goes out the door. Now, I mean, we are starting to change, right? So like you can start chipping away at the edge of the network where things may not create this cascading failure across an enterprise or across the country or your global network. So that's, the low hanging fruit is the edge of the network. And the more you can kind of separate the edge from the core.
Hey,
Yes,
Brent. So what happened to like Cumulus, and even like Arista seems to not, I mean, I haven't paid as much attention as you have, but Cumulus seems to have disappeared, sort of operating systems where they really decoupled the hardware, which gave us the ability to have more testing environments. And then, even Arista had seemed to have a heavy focus on sort of operating system and to be able to sort of, say this as a terrible word, but DevOps your network. But it seems like there's not as much emphasis on that stuff as it was even 5 or 6 years ago. Is that
DevNet ops?
Yeah, is that true? Because that was the area where I think you could build like an Arista virtual box.
Yeah.
Do some level of testing. Not complete. And then Cumulus even way further because it was a complete operating system. It wasn't even any hardware on it. You put it on hardware. But just it seems like that's sort of fizzled out, or I just.
Contrail? I just wanted to ask one question in the same, just so it was Contrail and Juniper and the way they're doing also a huge part of that shift? Because that's the other thing, is that a lot of that stuff felt like it got sucked up by Juniper. And so you're seeing the vendors kind of take control over the direction the tech went. That's just my thought.
Well, so I guess 2 things. one thing was, I was just going to ask offhand, I guess it dovetails into the other thing, is how much does, all of these, lots of these folks that work in, networking, as in are people doing the hard work in the networking departments. Thank you for keeping networks online. A lot of them are, very deeply certified and have, rubber stamps and, get to go on the special boat at like Cisco Live with all the other people who have all the certifications. Does that get in the way of people wanting to change stuff? The second point was also lots of these vendors try to have a single, pane of glass, like they have their own, management system for just their stuff, and it can't manage anybody else's hardware. And as we see, I'm not going to say Ansible, but things like Ansible and other tools that can automate things from multiple network vendors. Does that change the landscape at all of that? Everybody is very attached to one type of, one specific vendor or another.
Yeah, no, so like
Loaded
early,
questions.
no, I mean, it's beautiful. Early SDN was like this stupid, this was my perspective as well. I was part of the problem, was this, kind of dumb purity test around what is SDN. And if a vendor wasn't fully embracing this completely programmable data plane that fits to whatever the latest OpenFlow spec is, then it's not SDN. And that was kind of a garbage take. I was super guilty of that because at the end of the day, programming low-level flows is really hard. Just programming high-level database entries is really hard in a distributed environment, much less, now we've got this explosion of insanity around policy, right? So how am I going to articulate this really complex policy into these fine-grained flows across, possibly tens of thousands of nodes, and at the same time, do CRUD operations against it? I'm going to update it, I'm going to delete it, and all on top of an orchestration that's also sort of centralized in the sense that we've got these, whether it's Kube API, whether it's, the Kube master components, like that's all, I mean, it's everybody's building little internets, and we just assume that eventually it'll become consistent. So like you're always fighting that, and every PR you're going to push into whatever project you're working on, whether it's upstream, downstream, network drivers, CNI drivers, like whatever it is you're working on.
But
Like
what's going on in the 25 other projects? Is this going to conflict with all the other projects?
Right.
Similar?
Yeah. So I think like what was really necessary was having, having common sense ways to program the network. Maybe that was using a vendor's API. It got the job done. Ideally, it becomes a common API across platform, across vendor platforms. That opens up a whole can of worms. But that configuration management that you're touching on is definitely the first step, whether it's Ansible or other tools. That's where the innovation is really happening now, because those are configuration changes on the edge, and you're not getting bogged down into the madness of low-level granular, basically, editing memory and memory registries is what it's akin to in the network. And with partners, at Docker, we used to say batteries included but swappable.
Hey, that's a skippable thing too.
Yeah, but like now,
but first you need a soldering iron.
Right, exactly. Like batteries included or swappable in parentheses and 5 FTEs.
Battery doesn't really work at scale.
I mean, we can make anything work with enough money and resources thrown at it, right? And so, the tighter the relationship with the platform and the partner, obviously the better it rolls. But at the end of the day, do operators really need to get into that low level? I think we're seeing adoption because there's an abstraction layer that's there, and it's all getting described in YAML files. Now the problem is when somebody actually has to go in and troubleshoot it, that's when the wheels may or may not come off, and that's where support contracts start to make sense.
Remember in OpenShift, right? Like, not in OpenStack. Sorry to use that terrible word, but I remember it was like 9 control points to get to the host egress. And now if you think about like what it would look like with Kubernetes and the clusters, right? I can't even imagine from the sort of point of that you're sort of trying to control network policy to get all the way out of the host. I mean, it's just got to be worse than, I'll just say it, worse than OpenShift.
It's the iceberg that John and I used to run around with a slide deck on, pitching to people, right? You see a little bit of the network at the top, but underneath is where it all lives, and containers has just sped that up.
Not
because
only
it's-
do you have to learn how to operate a Kubernetes or a OpenShift or whatever, but maybe also Istio, maybe also, the things that, 12 other types of service meshes that all have weird networking stuff going on in all sorts of strange places, and make sure that that doesn't conflict with whatever equipment you actually have doing other things that already exist.
Because it all
And
works
here-
the first time, right? Every time.
Does. Everything
Well,
does.
it's because the batteries are in there.
That's right.
yeah.
Ever
And
ready.
here's where like being a vendor also feels really good once in a while from one of the big clouds, because I can think about the simplicity of a lot of that networking that has to be done. It kind of gets done on the back end and via service based. And so it makes me feel really nice to even see how you can define smaller networks using things like ARM and also using products like Ansible to create, networks full out. And so one of the things I think you've seen from places like where I work at Azure and all three is that even defining how networks are built at just the simple level using configuration management tools or deployment tools it's such a huge advantage from the way you had to do it before. That's just the way I like from being at a cloud vendor, not having to even worry about building SDNs if you can.
I think there's also, and when you are the vendor and you are a cloud provider, like you can collapse some of the complexity that the rest of the people, like there's this tyranny of the choices people have to make to configure all these things, right? They're super configurable, but the problem is they're super configurable. And when you look at what the cloud providers are doing and the way they're kind of forcing that conversation, like, oh, you do it this way, this is how we do it, and it like solves a bunch of those problems with choice.
I always opt for management when it comes to all my services. And if it can possibly be done with my networking, God, please.
I mean, that raises the other question about, I've tried to bring this up with, different people over the years, like what do you lose in that scenario? Do you lose some competitive advantages, right? Like the fact that, and the answer usually is not enough to care, but I always wonder, like, if you can get sort of rack to rack telemetry, or are there secret sources of sort of knowing where data is, where the cloud hides that from you? It's always been a question. And I think the answer I always get back is like, we don't care. Like there's nothing yet that's told us that we shouldn't just go to cloud and sort of follow what you're talking about, Jay, which is, I just don't want to worry about it. But
Yeah, I think there's been enough abstractions for the actual user to and also I guess the durability of modern cloud like networks and the actual durability of systems that are within those networks. I think we've reached a kind of a high point on reliability across the major clouds right now. And I think that in itself can be looked to be able to say, you know what, do we not have that like switch port level control of what we're doing like we did in the past? Sure. But you're also not having to replace line cards at 4 a.m. And so I think that's the rub.
Yeah, like Jay's got a really good point. I would counter that though with physics, because we can't, not that I'm some smart guy saying physics, time and space, right? Like we can't, we can only go as fast as the speed of light. And some of our workloads are dependent on just being on-prem. So as we explode out to the edge, as you're dropping hundreds or thousands of containers at your local retail store, there's performance, but there's also an interesting cost impact there that I think you can, it's expensive to move data. It's expensive to move data in and out of cloud. So I think there's a huge potential there. You know, like the container at Walmart. I don't know if John said, probably one of you smart people on here said this, but like the container at Walmart isn't going to be, it's going to be a shipping container in the back of Walmart with, a bunch of gear in it. And so, there's going to be a network there. And then, the cloud model doesn't necessarily fit that super well, or it may not fit it in a cost-effective manner.
I've talked to people about HFT stuff, high frequency trading.
Sure.
And I think that is the one kind of place where we really look at it as, where does latency mean the most for people right now? And it happens to be in two major worlds that we can think about. It's like gaming and financial transactions. And one, we've seen gaming successfully transition to the cloud. There's a number of examples of that. However, from what I know, I live a block from Wall Street. I meet a lot of people that do this. And I talk to people about HFT, and ultimately they're doing things like kernel bypass for networking. So I think that you're working with SDNs to just define how they can build these networks anyway. And so sure, they may have some hybrid processes, but most of the time they don't want to have anything leak out of where their networks are. So I think that the ability to make the fastest transactions possible is ultimately going to be what you're saying, time and space. That's always going to be a limitation. But I think for your average, when you think about edge locations for certain sorts of like data distribution, if you're talking about streaming media, if you're trying, I think that we're reducing the latency to the front end by high degrees. And so
there's no free lunch, right? And adding abstraction isn't necessarily
you changed your background. You're no longer in space. Now you're on Earth. That's amazing.
Now I'm in Tucson.
Yeah, it almost looks like Phoenix, but I guess yes, that's definitely Tucson.
That's fine.
I'm just saying, like, this is a debate about performance and when, like you can talk about the difference between running C code or Python code too, right? And for me, if I'm a high frequency trader, like I have a different set of constraints I'm trying to optimize for than if I'm trying to manage a university, or if I'm trying to manage an enterprise. And I wouldn't say the SDN, just like these other higher level languages from abstraction, you're not going to optimize your latency with that as a layer. Like that's not the goal.
Well, it was me, but I'm not that smart about the containers, Brent. But a person we really all know well that works at Google, he told me one time, I was having this argument about, is there a time when certain types of like high frequency trading is going to be an issue? And then his answer was, imagine that we can give you an instance on the exchange. Like we'll charge you a ridiculous amount of money for that instance, but that instance will be on the exchange. I'm like, okay, you win. But the other point I want to make is, I think the other part about networking, whether it's SDN or SD-WAN or whatever, is the edge is a bigger problem for a lot of things like autonomous vehicles. It's gambling. I mean, they're talking about putting shipping containers next to stadiums so that people can actually make bets in like a baseball game on the next home run, right? And then just like whatever, that aggregation point where people are putting containers, or they think they're going to do this. I don't think they're doing it well. Put physical containers with racks of Kubernetes and do the aggregation prior to sort of sending it up to the cloud. And I think that, Brent, we've talked about that. That's going to take some real creative networking thought to sort of get that all worked out.
Yeah, the data gravity problem is pretty amazing, and it just I think it's just as amazing because you can actually save money doing it. So like anything new that you can save money doing, I think is infinitely better than anything just new and is neat. So like if I can do a TCO and hand it to the CIO and say, here's how you're going to save money, even if it's total garbage and probably isn't going to work out, you're still probably going to get the project funded, as opposed to just like it's going to make things better.
Even if it's total garbage and it doesn't work. That's like,
no, I'm just saying the numbers are garbage because they're always garbage. And
yeah,
you go
but
back and look at it 4 years later, it's like, what?
At the same time, all of those whatever, be able to make your bet at the baseball stadium, all of those applications, the ones that are out there first, or the ones that are actually going to have influence over, talking to the whatever, the Verizons and other, all the large wireless vendors, et cetera, about, here's the problems we're actually having while trying to roll out this new cool thing. And like, why can't you give us this? This is the thing that we actually, this is where stuff is failing. And those are the folks that can help to define, like, how this could actually be better architected for them to avoid failures on. I'm totally betting that there's not going to be a single baseball game this week. I'll put $1,000 on that. I don't think it will bet against me. I think the odds of winning anything on that is like 0. Maybe in Japan.
Well, and you
There's-
mentioned
there's-
telcos. Like synchronicity is insane. Timing is insane in telcos. I mean, you're measuring in nanoseconds, milliseconds, and it's the tolerance for latency is just 0 because when you pick up the phone, you have to be able to dial 911 or
there's a whole nother like amazing opportunity for networking in what's called Factory 4.0, which is basically the idea that we need sub nanosecond like timing over all of the control vectors in the factory. So I may or may not have worked for a big company at one point that makes things like toothpaste. And one of the things that ends up happening is that if you determine there's something wrong with the toothpaste by testing, you have to throw 4 batches forward and 4 batches backwards away because you have to basically flush the machine and you have to like have a safety margin, right? But if you had the telemetry to know when the artifact, when the defect was injected into the production of the toothpaste, you could narrow the band of the waste. You could basically say, oh, we've determined there's something wrong, but we can see the telemetry changed here. And that means that you should start throwing it away from this point. And if you want to be really safe, you can have a boundary, but the boundary can be much smaller. But this requires most of the factories that make toothpaste are like in Brazil and in Puerto Rico, and they have internet infrastructures that look like they're in Brazil and Puerto Rico. Not the most advanced places that you've ever seen the software deployed to. So they have to completely replace all the networking inside of these factories in order to get this kind of capability in place. I think is really challenging and interesting as far as timing goes, and the way in which time limits certain applications right now.
And I almost wonder if some of that might also wind up dovetailing stuff like AI. Like, we've suddenly detected that instead of your crest having blue and green, it is suddenly purple, and
right.
that triggering something somewhere else. And but if you
And
don't have a functional network having AI make pictures and live assessment of things and whatnot is probably.
And there's been a huge amount of investment in factories in exactly that, and in edge, where the edge problem that you were trying to figure out with AI is how to forward deploy basically data filters into the factory, because you're going to have to send the stuff out of the factory to be processed by AI, right? You're not going to put a great big machine in the factory. So how do we make sure that we're like summarizing the data as quickly as possible and just shipping the necessary data out of here to be processed by AI? It's super interesting challenges, all these edge kind of network challenges. And I think that's like interesting for, fixed networks and fixed telemetry systems and things like that. But when you start, again, deploying those same concepts to things that move around a lot, like what if we could real-time track the telemetry of your car? Now you're talking about some really interesting problems for the same types of things.
Well, there's a guy here, Dave.
They call that Project Laverne and Shirley. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, no, there's a guy here at Georgia Tech that I met. He's working on this V2X stuff, which is car-to-car stuff, right? That gets crazy. Where cars are going to have to not only have these little substation, and he's actually running prototype pods here in Cobb County where cars can drive by, and they're setting up like Kubernetes clusters so that they can just basically not only capture within a radius of the car driving by, but they could actually share data between cars. Like it's like that stuff can't go up to the to the cloud or the host, right?
Yep. Or we had a bunch of like questions from people about like
now you're running etcd on every car.
I know. I didn't say it was a. I don't think the Chick-fil-A with the. I always joke that Chick-fil-A tried to put Kubernetes in every Chick-fil-A, and I can just imagine the person who's flipping the. They're not burgers, but they're like, hold on a second, can you go into such and such .yaml and edit it? Hold on, let me finish the fries.
You got a Coop cuddle before we get this spicy chicken sandwich
Yeah,
out,
that's
right?
right. Yeah, like which comes first, bro? Do I get the spicy chicken or the Coop cuddle? Yeah.
So no, I think the other question I had for like you networky nerds, like I think about when I go into big enterprises and
Nerd tribalism.
nerd tribalism. Yes, I'm trying to hang with them, but I'm not failing. When I go to enterprises, I like look at so we're going to start looking at ephemeral infrastructure stuff that pops up and down. Like these machines don't actually aren't what you care about. You care about managing your cluster of containers that are kind of coming and going at will. They don't really live anywhere. And so that this completely has destroyed your CMDB because all of your concepts of CMDB are based on physical machines in racks somewhere that someone personally put there and cared for.
They were based. It was based on hope and lies. Let's be honest.
Hope and lies as well. That's also true. Fairy dust was involved, but like that ephemerality. I'm wondering about like stuff like SDN. How is it related to the fact that some of these things are just kind of like popping in and out of existence willy nilly, and like, won't we need something like SDN just to manage the ephemerality of the instances that we're pointing at? Isn't that problematic, or am I just missing a whole thing?
No, I mean, you're absolutely, I mean, so like the idle guy was probably like 10, 20 years too early when it came to CMDB in the network, right? Because it's gone from a, now we can at least programmatically update a spreadsheet real time of what's there, as opposed to either, paying out the nose for some crappy tool that, runs a cron job once a day. And, there's not an SNMP string there that's right. So it's missing half of the half your inventory. So you're exactly right. So like I would count that as a low hanging fruit, right? Because it's basically how many nodes are in your cluster. So that's a pretty easy problem to solve. What's the serial number of the nodes in your cluster? What's the IP address of the nodes in your cluster? What's the software rev of the nodes in your cluster? So like that's where we start, that's the intersection, I think, of DevOps and networking, where we start treating the network nodes like any other node. So like that definitely falls in the low hanging fruit category. And I think that's something that like you can easily do today with, Ansible or, whatever your automation tools are.
So I don't want to reveal anyone, the guilt of anyone, but I have a back channel DM conversation where someone is explaining how they did something that's pretty interesting. And one of the points he just made that's related to what you just said is we treat a very large global network as a bunch of Linux boxes, no exception, no special tooling.
Like, and that's where hardware, like that's where we should have been going 10 years ago, is basically putting Linux on hardware. And so you're starting to see that with Open Compute and all the OpenX projects that are out there.
Hey, Brent.
It's like Viata was like 20 years ahead of when it needed to happen.
Then Broadcom destroyed.
Wasn't one of the problems with sort of SDN is the overlay, and so kind of going on, adding on to Jabe's question, not only ephemerality, but the fact that things were hidden. I mean, you don't even know the routes, right? Like the overlays and stuff like that. Wasn't there sort of a resistance from network people in general? Because, that idea.
I mean, myself included, right? Because it's the purest look at it is why should I abstract something when I can make everything proper and have an end-to-end network that makes sense? But it's all situationally dependent, in my opinion, still even today. But so like so Martin Casado, a decade ago came out with Nasir that kind of changed the world, but it was basically not to take anything away, he's the man, he's up there with like IP, BGP, MPLS, Holy Trinity. So, like what we used to do, in the early 2000s, if you had a remote site that you had, some disparate network in between, you would nail up a GRE tunnel. And it was, a lot of times it was pretty hackish. You had MTU problems. But it turns out that today that is kind of the de facto for setting up. If you don't want to involve yourself with networking people at all, you're going to set up an overlay and abstract out the pieces you have no control over. So, you know, we see that even with SD-WAN today, which we renamed VPNs to SD-WAN. Some marketing person is a genius for
More user
he's
friendly.
probably retired on millions of dollars for saying let's call VPNs SD and WAN. But you know, it's that idea. So it adds, you know, it adds to John's point in a tweet. You know, where's the agility in the network? Well, you get the agility in the network by bypassing the network. You know,
Bravo. Bravo.
Like, I think it's actually framed, the question's framed in the wrong way. It's like, where's the agility in the freeway system? Where's the agility in the trains, right? Like you get agility for the things that move on them. You're not necessarily reconfiguring those things constantly.
Right. Well, you're kind of divisioning labor. Just to go on that analogy, you know, my commute might involve a train and it might involve a bus. So there's kind of these different segments to it. And it's, you know, how much do I oversleep in the morning? So I can control some of those pieces, but not all of those pieces. I think, yeah, I think you're spot on. So yeah, so overlays are, you know, but you know, if you look at a Google network, right, like they're running a lot of open flow, they're running, you know, all custom flows. They just have the time and money and also the use cases to really need that granularity. Policy breaks the world though. So like when you start talking about where do I make money off of this? How do I save my organization money? It's replacing black box firewalls and load balancers with software firewalls and load balancers. Like that's the panacea, but it's also you're exploding what has to be done on those nodes now. Instead of just saying, here's a MAC address and an IP and some destination tunnel endpoint to get to it, or a destination route in my router, I'm now saying, here's this distributed, I'm taking a centralized firewall that had tens of thousands of access lists in it. And I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to take those tens of thousands of access lists and push those across 1,000 endpoints. Like,
Right.
Okay, can etcd do that? You know, I mean, how far can we push etcd to do these things is really what it comes down to.
But that's my layer 3, layer 7 thing, right? Like that like all this stuff about, you know, what service mesh and Istio Envoy. Whenever I ask True Network people, like, am I out of my mind or not, right? And is that this sort of, I think it's a false promise that actually Google has set up, to be honest with you, because they're sort of saying that, oh, you can do all this traffic management in Istio Envoy layer 7. But the truth is they're running OpenFlow for 10 years on all of their systems. So they actually have what most customers don't have is network traffic manager at layer 3.
They're building software that is being built by people who live in a different paradigm than everybody else who is actually potentially going to use it.
Right, but then they say, okay, things like the service mesh scales at Google scale. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, like banks don't have 10-year maturity OpenFlow running, doing traffic management. I don't know. Am I out of my mind, Brent, or no? Are we good?
No, I mean, you're right. And it's, you know, it's up to.
I mean, based on the fact Istio has been rewritten 4 times in the last year, I would say there's like other problems there. So,
but my understanding, at least partially, is that a lot of what Google does wouldn't use Istio in the first place because they try not to use networking as much as humanly possible. Like they don't make microservices that hop HTTP over and over again. They put everything as possible in the same machine and talk locally, not over the network, in order to avoid all that stuff. So I just wonder how much the tool is being applied in a way that Google doesn't apply it. And that's why the problems are popping up. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, and I think you compound that with the fact that a lot of work is being done at layer 3 already. So that's sort of the iceberg problem, right? Like what, you know, I think you're right. I don't know. I think it's a big question for our industry as sort of commercial companies start doing more east-west traffic in incrementing at a scale that is sort of cloud titanish. If that ever happens, I think they're going to find that the sort of layer 7 stuff is just going to be ill prepared to scale.
Well, and I think it's probably the same way that you guys talked about scaling out edge, and it's through summarizations, and it's through kind of creating these proverbial pods of policy or forwarding or whatever is interesting, and keeping those, not having to distribute those out, across a global network or across a global cluster. So, to your point, John, on, layer 3, right? So we're just talking IP addresses. The internet works because we can summarize the internet into, roughly, I think it's probably around 800,000 routes. IPv4 can be carved into, millions and millions of individual hosts, but it gets summarized into 800,000 routes, and that's how it scales. So we distribute those routes via summarization. So the same idea could maybe be applied to policy, but you're talking infinitely more possible scenarios and combinations.
It's that commons problem again. It's, the way in which the freeways are shared spaces, and your last mile is your problem. But once you get on to the public infrastructure, so the question is where to start the summarization to a certain extent. You know what I'm saying? Like, you got to establish the freeways, but then you got to figure out where the off points are best appropriated, I guess, or best installed.
The pathing and the on ramps and off ramps are like a big thing, right? Like that's all the planning basically.
Yep.
On a lighter note, how are your home cities right now?
Yeah.
I live in Arizona, so we're like killing it.
Yeah, I'm
Pittsburgh. In Allegheny, we have the fastest increase in infections anywhere on the planet right now, I believe. So we're doing well. I mean, we've only got like 90 a day, but it's still a lot faster than anybody else was going up.
I live in Fairyland because we're 4th on the list, and I don't think anybody in Georgia actually watches the news or knows this. So,
See, and I'm in the country. I think we had 1 case last week. So.
Oh wow.
I'm in here in New York City, and it's
I'm
actually
wondering
pretty.
why the rest of us are idiots.
No, I mean, I understand why the rest of the country isn't smart. We've known that for a while. But I mean, for the most part, we're in a really good position. We've been in one for a little while now, and the only thing we stopped was the idea of restaurants allowing people to eat in them. That was supposed to start yesterday, and based on just what we saw from other states, the governor said, let's just take a break. And I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah, good.
I actually I saw a photo yesterday of, we have a place here outside of Phoenix called the Salt River where people go tubing, and I had this momentary vision of I should just get some of my own personal caution by the order of Robin tape and just wrap it all up. And I know that since no one would actually, all these people clearly don't know how to read, so they wouldn't actually see that they would just assume it must be official, even though it says my name on it, and I could just wrap up. But then I was like, wow, it's like a gazillion miles and it's 110 outside. So in the alternate universe, that's what I'm doing right now. But in this universe, I'm just.
Hey, Robin, if you ever get that tape, send me a couple of rolls. I definitely want caution by order of Robin. I'll totally use that.
Yeah. Well,
I walk my dog all the time. So I was complaining with my sister about the fact that people will approach me to pat my dog. And A, I don't want them to pat the dog because the dog is, but B, I don't want them to approach me. So she sent me a bright orange shirt that says, stay away from me.
That's awesome. Well, stay away from my dog, really, right? So,
exactly.
It's interesting though, watching how much all of this has changed people's views on working from home, and the views on how everyone is handling all of this. It's suddenly working from home is okay, and many people, I worked at Red Hat again for about 10 years, and so it's always been, we've always known that some people here work from home and others don't, and watching lots of other folks go through some of the learning processes that teams have when they first have one remote person before they have 10 out of 20 has been fascinating to watch. Just learning how much more collaboration tools can actually help people out, and that it's not that terrible to work from home is
pretty good.
Been such an interesting evolution, and I wonder how much that is actually teaching people about how to work together in different ways, which I think is always good.
Hey, John,
Even if
just
it's
a
through a
shout out.
practice
Thank you
with-
for this interface. And got any, since you've been basically silent, any words of wisdom for us all here to end us, take us out on a bang?
No, I just appreciate the comments around people staying healthy and
Yeah.
you know, collaborate. This work at home thing is again fascinating. I've been an entrepreneur since 1997, start doing companies. I've worked at home all my life, right? So I'm used to it. My wife's used to it, but my friends aren't, right? So it's been very tough for people to collaborate. So I think a lot of new things and roles are coming out, and people are figuring it out. So I think I'm trying to be mindful of people's mental health,
Yeah.
honestly, and I think that's been a big thing for my kids too.
I think for those of us who work from home almost primarily, our primary get out has always been, I'm going to go sit by myself at a restaurant for lunch, or I'm going to get on a plane and go to another conference and be overwhelmed by 800 people before I go back to being by myself in my house. And I think
It's interesting. Jay's from New York.
For so many people too.
Jay's from New York. I grew up on the East Coast, and the joke was, no one really talked to you unless you had a dog and you were in the park. Oh, yeah, and everyone's friendly, and then you don't have a dog. Hey, what are you doing? Hey. So I've noticed that with the COVID and out here in California, I've been out here 20 years. I've seen more of my neighbors walking around than ever before, and I sit on my lawn now. With my wife and I sit and we have 6 feet parties and we wave to everybody. It's been social, interesting. So it's one of those things where I see people I've known, lived in a neighborhood for 10, 20 years, and I see them and I say hi and they say hi back. And I'm like, that's the first time I've ever said hi to that person. Like,
Yeah, I still don't know their name. Yeah, I've heard a lot of my neighbors take walks and they do their conference calls on speakerphone while they're walking, and I'm like,
there's a circuit of people in my neighborhood who are all doing conference calls. We're all waving at each other. We know we can't talk to them. We have the earbuds in, but we're walking around talking to each other, waving our hands around. It's the funniest thing. So some lightness in the bummer situation. But
thanks for
doing
all the things.
Yeah.
I enjoy these chats. You guys do a good chat. I love the format. Gets my inner geek comes out. I love it. And John will get the stream to the crowd chat.
Yeah. I failed AV in high school, so we'll just.
Yeah, I embedded a link on the side there.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun, and I love the comments. So thanks for doing it.
Yeah, it's great interface. Really, thanks.
Yeah, it's Node.js. We wrote it in 2013. We started this project. It's all Node, fully asynchronous on the cloud. Automatic updates, multiple social networks. It was really designed to simulate what we would see at the Cube, which is getting groups together, but not trying to be a Reddit thread in massive numbers. It was like more of how do you simulate a good panel discussion at an event where asynchronously, the more hosts you have, the better the format. And if you get like 5 or 6 good hosts, it hits their network, and then you get a little, convenient going on, and it's fun. It's productive.
I think we're still trying to figure out how to make the most use of all these mediums we're mixing together, because I think we got a little focused both times on the chat, which is great and insightful.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get reflected in the crowd chat as much.
Yeah, and this is my first time doing this, so I was like, should I be typing things? Should I be asking questions? Are we focused on certain things? Going back to like the Cube stuff, like we did that at Ansible Fest last year, and just thinking about, a forum like this where we've got Twitter questions coming in, or it's live streaming, and figuring out how to, not that you guys don't ask delightful questions, because you do, but, I also feel like there's tons of, interesting questions that people could upvote to be, asked.
If you give it like a panel discussion or a small little talk, that's worked well. We have a format now that we found a good best practices. You have a 15-minute or 10-minute talk, and then you go to the Q&A, and everyone's live answering questions, and that's a cool format because it's not a spam kind of like a broadcast. It's here's a statement, kind of a monologue, or we're going to talk about Kubernetes and management and networking, which is one of the topics I'd like to hear, and you riff on it for 10 minutes and you present an opinion, and then you go into the questions, and then you get a corpus of work out of it, and it's a good body of work. People,
I think it'd be fun to try that format where we have a presentation. I think it might also be fun to try short formal debates where it's like one
Yes.
person
That would be
takes
cool.
two sides.
lightning talk. It's like a lightning talk, right? So you get you get the rallying moment around the context, and then the free for all in the chats where you thread it, and then the votes determine the relevance because you vote. It sorts it at the end, and there's multiple views of the timeline versus
So
how it happened.
we'll keep playing with the format.
But you know, the
This
one
is
thing I
the
would say,
meta analysis. Sorry,
I've been
John.
doing this with Gene. Gene does it, and they never used to do the Zoom thing, right? It would just be pure crowd chat. And I think the thing I'm seeing with us is it's sort of Rob's point. Should we be doing both? I think we need to do both sort of equally, right? Because the way Gene's things work, where there was no video, you really just, and then you watch the viral thing happen because everybody was just focused on it. I like the video. But I think the thing that happens a little bit, I think for us so far is we've been, and great conversations, but we've been spending more time on the video and not as much time in the chat. So I think we just have to
So
balance.
I think honestly, like let's explore the synergy and use the chat as a way to interact with question and answer
I agree with that.
topic
totally.
more than the way that the Doge people do it.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to roll to my next meeting. It was good talking to everybody.
Yeah,
Thanks for
same.
having me.
Growing up,
Good to meet
Jay,
you.
was awesome. And,
Yay.
let's go
No
Yankees.
problem.
Let's go Yankees.
Two more, what, 3 weeks?
Yeah,
It's the
yeah.
opening day.
Number 28.
Take care. Bye.
All right. All right.
Bye.
All right,
The,
everybody.
Yeah. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to participate. I love what you're doing. I think that I've found that the content that comes out of the chat is real good production. It adds a lot of content and it's good community